I am successful, powerful, handsome, happy.
Newly elected Congressman Evan Baxter's life was going exactly as planned.
There he is, the big kahuna.
I think I have to do the dance.
Do the dance.
Until he met someone with a plan of his own.
Who are you?
I'm God. Flood's coming. And I want you, Evan Baxter, to build an ark.
Yeah.
Ain't that what you does?
Well, today must be my lucky day.
Now, no matter where he turns,
Those animals are following me.
See, if you had an ark, you'd have a place to put them all.
no matter what he does,
Wow, what's with the scruffle, Mountain Man?
When I shave, the beard grows right back in.
What happened? Did you fall in a mine shaft? Did you just come out of a coma?
No.
Were you attacked by a werewolf?
there's just no escaping
Obviously, the stresses of this office have proven too much for you.
his destiny.
I lost my job, everything. Why are you doing this? Why me?
You want to change the world, son. So do I.
Here we go.
Gentlemen, I have come up with a little construction project for us this weekend.
Oh! The whole weekend?
Yes, maybe a couple of weekends after that.
You're talking about building a boat. It might be something fun for the family. It'd be great in case it floods or something.
From the director of Bruce Almighty comes the next chapter in the almightiest story of them all.
I know that this doesn't make any sense. I just want you to trust me. Dad, I'm with you.
Me too.
Is that a llama with a hammer?
Let's finish this sucker.
This summer,
His name is Evan Baxter, and now he goes by New York's Noah. Evan's Evan, the weirdo with a beardo.
when it comes to saving the world, some assembly may be required.
Thanks.
I can't even get my cat to use a little box.
People, the flood is imminent! Is it too much to ask for a little precipitation?
Evan Almighty.
Everybody, hang on!
One of my favourite movies of all time. Yeah, I had to have that to start with. Actually, there's some good things in the movie. It gets across the point of how ridiculous it must have seemed for Noah to build a boat that, well, you know. Actually, if you want to know too why Noah lived to 600 years, work out how much wood he needed and how long it would take him to do the assembly. Quite a while, actually, so good thing he was around for, I think it was 950 years in total, wasn't it? But the flood came at about 500 or 600, sometime around there. So, yeah, Noah's Ark can be a little bit controversial, can't it? And it's interesting because I don't think I've ever had to preach on it, but I've sure heard a lot of talks on it and read a lot about it. And when you actually go back to the Bible and read the story again, because before I preach I'll read it 20, 30 times, especially a long passage like this, and you start to realise, a lot of what I thought was in there isn't actually in there, you know, the old Christmas story all over again. But anyway, this morning we're going to look at Noah and his boat. The word for ark is box or chest is the original word. Some would say coffin was how they interpreted the word that's used. Yeah, let's start. So I don't know if you saw the news the other night, but they had the World Press photo winners from 2021. I'd already done this a couple of weeks before, so I was ahead of the time. So this is some of the photos that won the competition. So this guy's in his back pool in the US, of course. Probably Texas, but I don't know. And he has, you can see there, a flamethrower, and then he has put out here his arsenal, you know, along the side of the pool, only in America, you know, talking about gun culture. Looks like he's got a grenade thrower there, a few machine guns, I'm sure. The Myers down there would be able to give me a better description of some of the armoury there. So it's just, you know, just the normal sort of thing you have collected beside your pool, you know, and your shed down the back, isn't it? What every person should have. This is one of the ones they had on the news. The year of COVID. Well, more than that now, isn't it? Oh, sorry. And this was the award-winning photo. The guy who took it didn't realise that these, when he took it, an angel, shape of angel's wings. So this is from Brazil. So if you remember a few weeks ago, Christine began by an introduction to Genesis, and she divided it into 3 acts. The first act, she said, was the creation of a people of purpose and hope. And our story today, I've changed it slightly because it's really the finding a person of purpose and hope. And then Christine talked about Act 2, creation undone, hope lost. And in today's story, it's creation undone, but it comes as a judgment from God this time. And Act 3, God's promise leads to the restoration of purpose and hope. And we will see how that pans out in today's story. So Act 1, Scene 1, finding a person of purpose and hope. Like I said, you know, here's God speaking to you and you're to build an ark. Who are you going to find to build a boat? Boat that's never been built before. So really this story is not about a flood. It's about a man and a boat. And I think probably we get often tied up in the science of the flood or the lack of it. Probably a little bit on the science of the boat or whether it could have happened or not or impossible. You know, things like, I read they reckon you could fit 1.24 million sheep in the ark that size. I don't know why you'd want to put 1.2. My daughter said no, Laura said no, 1.24 million dogs. That would be mine, not sheep. So yeah, well, maybe you could, but as I said, I don't know why you'd fit 1 million sheep in there, but you could. 170,000 animals, they reckon, and food and everything else you could fit in the ark. Maybe. Whatever it is, it was a big boat. We'll see later. Why God found Noah to be the best amongst his contemporaries. In that explanation lies the central purpose of the flood account in the book of Genesis. That's why it's there. It's not to tell us about destruction of the world, although that is part of the story. It's to tell us about Noah and why he was chosen. Hebrews 11:7. It was by faith that Noah built a large boat to save his family from the flood. He obeyed God, who warned him about things that had never happened before. The flood had never happened before. By faith, Noah condemned the rest of the world and received the righteousness that comes by faith. That is why that story is in Genesis. It's to show us there was a man of faith. And for me that's quite encouraging to see that there is the possibility of people who please God. Because Noah was before the time of Exodus, so the law hadn't been given. There weren't a whole lot of rules or directions on how to live life and please God. But he knew how to please God, obviously, or God was pleased with him. And so we can see that relationship with God was possible. We can see that he was a man of obedience. And in his obedience, he did what?
Made a fool of himself.
Well, he did make a fool of himself. He certainly did that. But he saved himself. He saved the world through being obedient. Well, there's a good lesson in that for us all, isn't it? He was blameless. He listened to God and did what God asked him to do. I don't know how it worked back then because the Holy Spirit wasn't around. Well, not like we have it today. But God spoke. Noah heard God speaking and he listened. And as we know with the word listening, you don't listen in Hebrew unless you actually obey what you hear. If you don't obey, you haven't listened. So he listened and he obeyed. He walked with God and he did not corrupt God's way. And you have this contrast between, in chapter 6, the beginning of chapter 6, the world full of people who were corrupt and violent, and an upright and blameless man, Noah. So Noah goes into the ark, in a sense, not as a mere survivor, but as the bearer of God's promise. If Noah doesn't survive, mankind is lost. And it's interesting, the analogy the New Testament writers talk about the waters of baptism. And you can draw the conclusion that just as we go through the waters of baptism, we also are the bearers of God's promise. It's a challenge for us. And I like this cartoon. There's always a doubter in the crowd. So, Act 2, creation undone, judgment. And we see this probably, well, I think summed up really well in the closed door, where we read that he filled the ark, Noah and his family, the animals, and then God closed the door. And the writer is presenting us with two choices. Either we're with the people outside the ark, or we're with the people inside the ark with Noah. And that's the choice we still in a sense have today. Are we going to join Noah on the ark, be seen as someone, as Fiona said, as fools in the sight of everyone else? Or are we enamoured by the world and will prefer to stay outside the ark? Richard Rohr has this term he calls liminal space. It's used by quite a few. It's a spiritual position where humans hate to be, but where the biblical God is always leading them. And Noah found himself here, an in-between place, a place of transition. And what's interesting about this place is this is often the place, well, where we strike an inner crisis. You have left the tried and true behind, or it has left you, and you have not been able to replace it with anything else yet. And for Noah, being stuck in the ark, I don't know about you, but 12 and a half months, a year and a half, and over a year in a boat with a whole lot of smelly animals, family members, and unlike what you see, not many windows, does not sound to me a great place to be. But that's where he was. And for Noah, there was obviously, I don't know, but if I was in Noah's position, I'd have a lot of questions. Okay, you know, maybe something new and wonderful was in the works, but who knew what was God doing? And we all face times like this, don't we? When you find out your specialist tells you you've got cancer, and you go, okay, God, what's going on here? Maybe you've broken up with your girlfriend, or situations like this. Sometimes we find ourselves in a place, and this is the place where we ask these sorts of questions. And for Noah, it was probably, are we ever going to get out of this boat? And hurry up, God, because I've been here a while. The encounter that took place between God and Noah would be completely reorientating, life-transforming, life-changing, and it would certainly transform things forever. So Noah was in the ark behind a closed door. I love, this is again one of my favourite cartoons. So here's Noah's Ark, and you can see in the distance one of these modern steamers, reasonably modern, and it pulls up alongside Noah's Ark and says, "Welcome aboard, not a moment too soon by the look of that old tub." And of course we know what boat they've just hopped onto. The Titanic, by the way, was, they estimate, three times larger than Noah's Ark. So a little bit out of proportion here. But yeah. So which boat are we going to be on? Act 2, Scene 2 was the flood. The Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth. He saw that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. So the Lord was sorry he had ever made them and put them on the earth. It broke his heart. And the key for me here is that God's judgment came out of a broken heart. It didn't come out of anger, although he had every right to be angry, because as we know in Genesis, he'd created man, he'd created the world for mankind, that there would be good things happening, good things going on, and humankind had turned it around, and there was nothing but, it says in there, evil. Humankind left to themselves is bad news. God saw what was going on, and all he saw was corruption, vice, dishonesty, exploitation and violence. And so he needed to judge the world. Well, he had every right to judge the world. This is a big hang-up for many non-Christians, isn't it? Why would God send a flood to destroy everyone? Why did he? Because what God had decided to destroy had in a sense already destroyed themselves. They had brought about their destruction and their judgment. It was a reversal of the process of creation from chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. Now it was, in a sense, decreation, destruction. But God never leaves us there, and so we come to Act 3, the restoration of purpose and hope. And we see this with Act 3, Scene 1, as he releases a raven and a dove. Well, even before that we see it was because the wind blew, the waters receded. God remembered and was faithful and timely and intervened. And we know that God keeps his promises and he can be trusted. So God was not going to leave create the world where it was. He was going to start things all over again. Noah's deliverance is an image of the salvation of the faithful. It's interesting, the waters receded and Noah waited. I think it was like 7 days and sent the birds out. And then after that, another few more days. And then 2 more months until God finally said to him, you can leave the ark. So he waited for God's command. And the picture is given, as we see, of a return to the work of creation. So God begins the whole, well, not the whole, but starts the creation again. The animals, the vegetation. And then we come to Act 3, Scene 2, an altar. So we have the same problem, but 2 very different outcomes. You see, the problem is we will see, if you go past the story, what does Noah do later on? Chapter 9, end of chapter 9. Noah, once he's out of the ark, once he's back, he decides to plant a vineyard. And then he gets drunk. And then something pretty bad happens again, and it's like, okay, this is the story all over again. God had he had every right again to bring about the destruction of Noah and those who were left. But the Lord was pleased with the aroma of the sacrifice and said to himself, I will never again curse the ground because of the human race, even though everything they think or imagine is bent toward evil from childhood. I will never again destroy living things. And so he enters into a covenant, a bond in blood. And he says, I will not flood the earth again because of Noah's sacrifice. Here's an aside for those of you who want to look at, get into the details of the story. Where did the wood come for the altar, to make the sacrifice? Probably weren't too many trees at that point in time. Maybe he had a stack of wood on the ark, we don't know. But maybe he had to start pulling the ark to bits, so he had some wood for the to make the sacrifice, which is interesting, isn't it? Burning, as I put there, burning all your bridges. But that's inside, we don't know. So who does Noah's act of intercession point us to whom? What is Noah, you might say, the model, the paradigm for? And the Lord will save the world because of Jesus, an accepted sacrifice. Noah becomes a model to us for the kind of leader we're awaiting, the one who enters the waters of death and comes out the other side, a new creation. And so we come to the final scene of this story. A rainbow. God's promise leads to the restoration of purpose and hope. Act 3. I should have handed those out. Liam, you want earlier on, I forgot, sorry. God's promise leads to the restoration of purpose and hope. It's interesting that in all other biblical covenants, the signs are given for human participants. But in this case, the sign, it says in the scripture, is so God will not forget. But as we all know, God doesn't forget, does he? So why is he given the sign? Why is the sign for God? Well, in Hebrew, when you talk about remembering, it's just not recollecting something, it's not remembering something, but it's actually putting into effect an action. When God remembers, He intervenes. So the covenant established in Genesis 8 and 9 reveals God's care and concern for the entire created order. This is a covenant not just made with Noah and his offspring, but with all creation. Life on earth is guaranteed to continue in spite of human sin. So God says, I will not flood the earth ever again. And I have put the rainbow in the sky so I don't forget the promise, the covenant I've made with you. I've noted that this covenant is undeserved, generous, unconditional, and a perpetual agreement, which means it's a covenant quite different to the Mosaic covenant which would come up later on, isn't it? This covenant was unconditional. Some of the later covenants would be conditional, or the Mosaic being the main one would be conditional. This one was generous, undeserved, and would last forever. So I finished with this question for you. I think I've put it at the bottom of the sheet. How do you see yourself and the world? Anyone guess where this photo is from? 2020? Beirut. Yep. This was the fertilizer bomb. Well, it wasn't. It was a silo filled with fertilizer that acted like a bomb when the fire started and utterly destroyed a huge part of Beirut city. So how do you see yourself in the world? Do you see it like this? Focus in upon the good news, the bad news, and forget the good news? If you listen to the newspapers and read everything else, it pretty much looks like this, doesn't it? Or do you focus upon the rainbow, God's promise that leads to the restoration of purpose and hope? It's important, I think, that we focus upon, in a sense, the rainbow, and not the world as so many see it. Let me just finish with prayer. Lord, we thank you for the covenant that you made with Noah, that an eternal covenant that you have made with us as well. We thank you for Jesus, who was the ultimate sacrifice. That means that we can be saved. Help us, Lord, to be a people who have purpose and hope in this world today, Lord. Help us to be a people who love you and follow you with all our heart, soul, mind and strength, that we might be a blessing to others. Amen.